So seeing as we're already talking about Rhodesia, I think it is fitting to continue in this lane that we found ourselves in and talk a bit about the crucial role that Zambia played during the second Chimurenga with the support that they rendered to the Zimbabwe African People's Union, Zapu, and its military wing, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA. Now, Zambia did host both the Zimbabwe African People's Union and the Zimbabwe African National Union, which was the other political party that was engaged in an armed struggle through the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA. But this little section here mostly deals with the relations between Zapu and the Kaunda administration and Lusaka. So Zapu was a successor to the National Democratic Party, which was banned by the Rhodesian government under Edgar Whitehead in December of 1961. The NDP was a successor to the Southern Rhodesia African National Congress, which was banned in February of 1959 under Whitehead's government as well. Edgar Whitehead passed security laws that were meant, in his words, to deprive the African leaders of their civil and political rights. Examples of those laws that he passed being the Preventive Detention Act, which enabled the government to lock up anyone for 5 years without trial, the Unlawful Organization Act, which banned almost all the African political organizations which existed in Southern Rhodesia, and also the organizations of Africans in Nyasaland and in Northern Rhodesia. The following excerpt that I'm going to read is from a paper that was written by Joshua Nkomo, who was the founder and leader of all the nationalist African parties that I just mentioned. The paper is called Crucible of Privilege, Southern Rhodesia. And he wrote this in 1959, just a few months before the banning of the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress. And yeah, here it is. There is still time for Southern Rhodesia to retreat from disaster, and with dignity. We of the Congress, by the very nature of our policy, offer the settlers the opportunity of beating a retreat in time. We ask the reconsideration of discriminatory laws, the Native Affairs Act, the Urban Areas and Accommodation Act, the Pass Laws, the Electoral Act, the Unlawful Organization Act, and the Preventive Detention Act, end quote. So following all attempts at the pursuit of a diplomatic solution being blocked and stonewalled by the ever right-wing leaning Rhodesian government, the Zimbabwe African People's Union was formed, and that also got subsequently banned in September of 1962. And the following is a quote from Abraham Kiwane, who was recruited by Joshua Nkomo to bring weapons into Zimbabwe from Tanzania through Zambia. In 1962, when Zapu was banned, we were summoned to UNIP headquarters by President Kaunda. At the end of the meeting, I was summoned to Mr. Kapwepe's home, where I met with Joshua Nkomo, Kenneth Kaunda, and Simon Mwansa Kapwepe. So Simon Mwansa Kapwepe, for those of you who don't know, was a very crucial element of achieving Zambian independence and was a very key ally for Kaunda in the first 8 years of the governing of Zambia after it achieved independence. And just also a random factoid for you, Zambia has the name that it has right now because it was given by Simon Mwansa Kapwepe. In my opinion, he's one of the most brilliant minds, politically, culturally, that ever existed in Zambia. And anybody who's able to get their hands on his works, the ones in English and the ones in Bemba, if you can read Bemba, please do, and read up on the incredible mind that Simon Mwansa Kapwepe had. Okay, back to the quote. At the meeting, they asked me if I could spare some time in the following weeks and months in assisting Zapu cadres who were to do some missions between Mbeya in Tanzania and Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, end quote. The weapons would be smuggled from Egypt through Tanzania and Zambia, according to the South African History Archives. So Richard Dube, who was a commander of ZIPRA operations and spent quite a lot of time in their Zambian bases and camps, describes the approach they had to deal with air bombardment from the Rhodesians, because there was quite a lot of air bombardment coming from the Rhodesians with the help of the South Africans through various ways, because when the armed struggle was happening, operations were being launched from Zambia. There would be small sort of encampments of freedom fighters that would be formed somewhere and would be dotted across the Zimbabwean bush at any given time, pretty close to the Zambian border. But the bases where planning would happen, the bases where weapons would be stored, the bases where supplies would be replenished were mostly in Zambia. So the Rhodesians, realizing that, would engage in bombing campaigns against those bases in Zambia. And they would also engage in bombing campaigns against refugee encampments, because the war of liberation in Zimbabwe for the Rhodesians was not just a war to quell the rebellion and stop the terrorists. It was a war of extermination. What they wanted to do, and what they had initially planned out to do from the time that the project of Rhodesia started, from the unilateral declaration of independence, was to get rid of the native population that existed, to squeeze them into small areas of land that was not viable and that could not provide any sort of economic gain, and to populate the land that people were ethnically cleansed from through mass immigration of Europeans into Rhodesia. So the quote goes as so. What used to happen in the camps in Zambia during those days when the Smith regime was bombing, each morning the commander would evacuate the base or the camp, move the people maybe some 10 kilometers north, others south, others east, so that the camp would remain empty space and vacant. When the camp was empty, even if the enemy came, it would just bomb the camp and the people would be safe, far away from the center of the camp. End quote. In 1977, Kenneth Kaunda announced that Zambia was in a state of war with Rhodesia. At this point, the war had been raging on between liberation forces and the settler occupation forces for about 13 years. And the Washington Post actually reported on this in an article that was released on May 16th of 1977. And you can read up on that in your own time. But yeah, during these years, Joshua Nkomo, who was the founder and the leader of Zapu, and one of the key negotiators of achieving Zimbabwe's independence, was based in Lusaka and had assumed the role of supreme military commander. By 1978 to 79, the Rhodesians were trying to contain Zipper forces in Zambia and were failing horribly. Richard Dube actually describes how the Rhodesian forces had to retreat when they faced off against one of the 3 Zipper battalions that had received training in Zambia at Mulungushi. Mulungushi, for those of you who don't know, is in central Zambia. So the quote goes as so. They had already tested that when they attacked the battalion at Kariba. It was one of the battalions that had been trained at Mulungushi. The battle at Feira took almost 2 weeks. Then they were unable to defeat that battalion and they lost quite a good number of planes and men. They realized if they could be resisted by a single battalion using all the equipment and special forces they had, what more with 3 battalions? End quote. I could keep on going on this topic and adding in more quotes and so on and so forth, but this would end up being a much longer video than it's already going to be. And I think we've given quite a bit of time to speaking about Rhodesia. Maybe that's something I should dedicate a singular episode to doing, because there is quite a lot of information, most of which is not available online, because the only perspective or the majority of the perspective that tells the story of the second Chimurenga is told from the perspective of people who are fawning over and sucking the dick of the Rhodesians online. Excuse my language. So I'm sort of going to end it here and move on to the next thing. But the last thing that I will mention about Lusaka and Kaunda's importance in the liberation of Zimbabwe is this one thing. When Robert Mugabe was released from an 11-year prison sentence in Rhodesia, he went into exile. And he spent a good bit of that time in Zambia, along with spending some time in Mozambique, where most of the Zimbabwe African National Union's military operations were being launched from. Mugabe, on top of him having spent quite a bit of time in Zambia during his exile after his release from prison, much earlier in the mid-1950s, Mugabe also spent some time in Zambia as a lecturer at Chalimbana Teacher Training College, which is in Lusaka. And he spent the years of 1955 to 1959 in Zambia as a lecturer at this teacher training college. And while he was there, he was also studying for his Bachelor of Education. He was also studying for his Bachelor of Education degree from the University of London through correspondence.